Hi everyone, I'd like to go over with you practicing punctuation. This week you're going to learn about commas and other forms of punctuation so that you can actually apply it immediately into your essay number 2 as you're revising. So here's some comma rules, and there are a lot, so I'll just go over some. Use a comma to separate main clauses joined by one of the coordinating conjunctions, and these words are for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. And so these are words that you're using to join two independent clauses together, like two statements that can stand on their own and make complete sense. Um, I went to the store, comma, and then I went to school. So for this example, we went to the game, comma, but it was canceled. We went to the game stands on its own and makes sense. The part of the sentence where it says it was canceled also stands on its own and makes sense. The word but joins the two, and so you definitely need a comma between game and but. Use a comma after long introductory modifiers. The modifiers may be phrases or dependent clauses. So if you have a sentence that starts with a word like before or after or when or since or because, then you're going to want to have a comma eventually because we're waiting for more information. Before she and I arrived, comma, the meeting was called to order. Let's look at some examples that you might apply into your paper. So I wrote these sentences out, and I did this for a lot of the slides so you can see how this might apply to you. Pearlstein strongly appeals to readers' common sense through this data on salary differences, and this carefully presented research reinforces his credibility. Notice how this carefully presented research, that whole last part can stand on its own and make sense, and everything in the first part up to differences could stand on its own and make sense, and then it's joined by this and, so we need a comma there. The next sentence says, although Gibbs presents his own personal testimony as evidence, readers would be more convinced of his argument if he were to present other types of testimonial support related to the STEM workforce. So although, it starts with although, so we know there has to be a comma eventually. And if we don't put a comma, we're going to have something it's called a run-on issue. So we want to make sure we have the proper punctuation to set off the sentence. I want to show you a really cool syntactical structure. When you use correlative conjunctions like not only, but also, they're partners, they go together, and you want to make sure that you set these off with commas. So the first part of the sentence says, not only does Bidwell present experts who support her argument, comma, but also she cites experts who express concern about implementing vocational programs. So what I really like about the not only but also setup is that whenever you're trying to show two things that are happening, like it's not limited to just one thing, the author's also accomplishing this other thing, I really like the correlative structure of not only but also. Just make sure you have a subject and verb in each part of it in order to justify the comma being there. So Bidwell is the subject, and then does present is the helping verb. Here we have the she as the subject of this part of the sentence, and then cites is the verb. So everything checks out and the comma is justified. Here's some more comma rules. You want to use a comma to separate words, phrases, and clauses in a series. So an example would be, he ran down the street, comma, across the park, comma, and into the forest. If you were to apply these kinds of rules to your essay, then you would put Gibbs presents, expert opinion, comma, personal testimony, comma, and logical reasoning. Those are 3 different types of evidence. Bidwell seems to target parents, comma, students, comma, and educational professionals. Anytime it's a list of more than 2 items, so here we're looking at 3 in the series, then you definitely want to have the commas in there. More comma rules. So use a comma to separate coordinate adjectives not joined by and that modify the same noun. An example would be, I need a sturdy, comma, reliable truck. Another example is, she is a pretty, comma, smart girl. In both of these examples, you'll notice that you could insert an and where the comma is. So you could say, I need a sturdy and reliable truck, or you could say, she is a pretty and smart girl. And this comma is really important right here because then you're not confusing that with she is a pretty smart girl, which is saying she's fairly intelligent. We want to differentiate the two and saying she's both attractive and she also is very intelligent. So applying this to your essay, you might have a sentence where you describe your author and you could say, Pearlstein is a professional, comma, knowledgeable writer. What you're really saying with that comma is, Pearlstein is a professional and knowledgeable writer. Just make sure you can substitute the comma with an and you'll know that the coordinate adjective rule does apply and it checks out. And lastly, here's some more comma rules before we move on to some other punctuation. So this is a comma to separate sentence elements that might be misread. An example would be outside the thunder rolled, which, lets us know it's outside, not outside the thunder, like outside of the thunder. We're trying to differentiate between the two ideas. Use commas to set off non-essential words, phrases, and clauses. And so here, Maria will pass is the original idea, but we're saying Maria, comma, who studied hard, comma, will pass. So we know that's added information, but it's not necessary for the rest of the sentence to make sense on its own. If you were to apply these rules to your essay, you could say, Bidwell, comma, who presents both her argument and counter-argument, comma, seems fair-minded about the issue on vocational programs and its benefits versus concerns. Bidwell, comma, who first presents William Fuller's success story within vocational training and work, comma, exposes where she stands on the controversial issue. So we're setting it off with commas because it's not necessary to the main part of the sentence, but you might want to include, but it helps to make the sentence sound even more meaningful, for sure. So miscellaneous comma rules, I guess this is the last slide, for just if you want to learn about any of this. An example would be, what do you intend to do, comma, Hamlet. That's when you're introducing a name, you're directly addressing somebody. And then this is what it looks like when you're separating the numbers in a date. November 11th, comma, 1918, comma, is a date worth remembering. If it's in a sentence like this, you definitely have to have the comma after the year. Only when it's the month, the date, and the year embedded in the middle of the sentence like this, then you need that comma there. Otherwise, you wouldn't. And then you use commas to separate the city from the state. You want to make sure you're not putting a comma between the state and the zip code. So here's how you would also use commas to set up your quotations. You need Bidwell explains, comma, and then you set off the quote. You could also use Pearlstein emphasizes, comma, and then the quote. You could have Gibbs Jr. reasons, comma, and then the quote. And notice all of these are active verbs: explains, emphasizes, reasons. And then here I have one really long one where you can see that we're giving credit to the primary source in the article, Kyle Tucker. Kyle Tucker, one parental testimony in the article, comma, shares, and then I cite the secondary source, which is the author, at the very end in parentheses like this, if I'm trying to do proper MLA style. So if you're looking for active verbs like this because you're getting stuck with saying things like thinks or says or states, and you just feel like, even the word writes is kind of obvious, so you want to come up with more active, interesting verbs, then make sure you look at the Paces handout because there's like a list of really great verbs you can use to explain the rhetorical moves of your author, and that is important. Just make sure you use the name or the pronoun, and then you set it off with a comma when you use the verb. When you use italics in writing, you want to make sure that you italicize the title of the book, a poem, if it's a long one, plays, magazines, motion pictures, musical compositions, newspapers, works of art, names of aircraft and ships, and letters, numbers, and words referred to by their own name. And so what you'll notice is here we have the title of a book, War and Peace. And then here we've got applying it to our essay. We could definitely use italics with the Washington Post, U.S. News, and Scientific American, which are all of the titles of your author's article. So just make sure in your final draft that you've italicized those articles. Rules with dashes. The dash is used when a stronger pause than a comma is needed. It can also be used to indicate a break in the flow of thought and to emphasize words. less formal than the colon in this situation. I'm going to go over colons in just a little bit, actually. So an example would be, I can't remember the town. Now I do. It's Tupelo. And that's just an interruption. That's a break in thought that we're having here. Let's look at it with how the authors use it. So in Pearlstein's article, he uses dashes. Underemployment, the barista problem, is also overstated. Bidwell also uses dashes in her article, and she uses it in this way. But how and where that training takes place, whether in a college classroom or an auto shop, can be quite varied, Edwards says. So you'll notice that they're just interrupting the main sentence that they've gotten here, they've got written here. So underemployment is also overstated. And then everything outside of the dashes in this second sentence, you can see that that's the original thing that Edwards is trying to get at. But how and where that training takes place can be quite varied. Applying dashes to essay number 2. So if you were to use dashes in your own writing, which I would love it if you guys use dashes, you might say, and these are sentences that I wrote myself, although Pearlstein strongly appeals to readers' common sense here, his sense of logic later, using data from Georgetown University Center, is somewhat flawed. I could probably cut out sense. I probably said that twice, so I could probably say his logic later. That would probably sound cleaner. The second example that I came up with is people who read this article, the targeted majority being parents, students, and educational professionals, mostly will be convinced by the author that vocational programs are beneficial and should be implemented. So I just want to point out one quick thing here, and it's that even though I'm okay, on this second example, I'm using dashes, but notice I'm also using commas. So if I didn't use dashes, that would be probably confusing if I had way too many commas in this sentence. So I would not want these dashes here in this second example to be replaced with commas, because then I'll have commas here, and then I'll have a comma after parents and students, and that's like 4 commas. That's just a lot, and it can be confusing. So I do want to show that there's a different purpose happening here in my sentence. I have a different intention. I do want to break thought here rather than this one is a series, it's a list. So the dashes just end up making the sentence a lot cleaner. That's why I like to use dashes. So using colons, you're going to want to play with this. It's a great thing to practice in your writing if you don't already. The colon is a formal part of punctuation used chiefly to introduce something that is to follow, such as a list, a quotation, or an explanation. An example would be, these cars are my favorites: Cadillac, Chevrolet, Toyota, Oldsmobile, and Pontiac. And if the list comes first and the explanatory sentence comes second, then it's a dash that you need instead. So if I all I did was switch this sentence around, okay? I put the list first and the explanatory statement second, and look what happens. I don't need the colon anymore. It becomes a dash because I'm breaking thought. Cadillac, Chevrolet, Toyota, Oldsmobile, and Pontiac. These cars are my favorites. If you were to apply the usage of the colon to your essay, you might say something like, and this is what I did, I came up with these, hoping to elicit some guilt and self-awareness, Pearlstein targets parents with the following language. And then anytime you use the word following, that lets us know that's the explanatory statement leading directly into the quotation. So you want to make sure you use something stronger than a comma here. You need the colon, okay? Bidwell references the following educational professional, and if she were to cite an expert opinion right there, that's where it would go, and you would need a colon. Gibbs defines diversity with this statement. That's leading directly into the quote, so you'll need a colon there. Anytime it's like this, where it's a full explanatory statement, then you're going to need the colon. And with rules with parentheses, parentheses are used to set off material that is of relatively little importance to the main thought of the sentence. Such material, numbers, parenthetical material, figures, supplementary material, and sometimes explanatory details, just skipped me. Okay, I found my slide again. So this is on rules with parentheses, and you'll see here that this is actually An example of how you might use parentheses: the years of the era, 1961 through 1973, were full of action. And then the last statement is I paid $20, and then that's in a numerical form for that mouse pad.